When I train people in the art of communications, we often start with a lot of in-depth understanding of who they are as people, what makes them tick as someone, that then makes them able to be a lot more empathetic of who they're speaking to and why. And I think that from a leadership perspective is a good thing, because the more leaders know themselves, the more they become much better communicators.
Welcome to the GovComms podcast, bringing you the latest insights and innovations from experts and thought leaders around the globe in government communication. Now, here is your host, David Pembroke.
Hello and welcome once again to GovComms, a podcast about the practice and function of communication in government and the public sector. My name is David Pembroke. Thanks for joining me. As we begin, may I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from where we are broadcasting today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise the ongoing contribution they make to the life of our city and this region. May I also pay my respects to all First Nations people of the lands from where anyone listening to this podcast today is joining us from. So surely the work of government communication must be about more than simply informing people, that it needs ultimately to be about encouraging people to understanding and action. On the receiving end, citizens are often sceptical and expectations are high. People want to know what government is doing and why, and they want that communication in their preferred form and channel at the time of their choosing. So how do we step up and find and tell the stories that resonate with people? And how do we prepare for a future where transparency isn't optional, it will be compulsory? Well, today on GovComms, we're joined by Natasha Plowman, who has spent her career answering those questions and empowering others to do the same. She is a communications strategist, media trainer and advisor. She works with senior executives to improve their storytelling. She is the founder of Spinning Red, that delivers online and on-demand learning programs and training on topics like storytelling, sustainability, and avoiding greenwashing. Natasha also co-leads Break the Silence, an industry movement championing a fairer and more inclusive PR and communications sector. And she joins me on the line from Lausanne in Switzerland. Natasha Plowman, welcome to GovComms.
Thank you very much for having me.
Listen, before we jump into the substantive conversation, tell us your story. How is it you have found your way into the world of communications?
Well, I mean, first I'll acknowledge the fact that I am Australian. So if people get confused when I talk about lots of things happening in the UK and Europe, I've been there for 23 years, but born and bred in Australia, in Sydney. I was always quite politically active from quite a young age. And when I went to university, I was very much involved with Emily's List, which is obviously a platform to get more women politically active, and had the first university-based chapter of Emily's List. And from that, I studied politics at university, I studied industrial relations. And for me, politics and communications are intertwined because it is about impact and influence. It is about, like you said in your introduction, giving people information, but also igniting a conversation about what kind of world we want to live in and the role that we as individuals play, but also companies. Since the last 20 years, I've been more active in corporate sector than necessarily politics or a government sector. And so for me, that's what communications is. It's impact and influence. It's about really influencing people's actions, attitudes and behaviours, but also representing people's attitudes, actions and behaviours more effectively.
So through that experience over quite a period of time, what do you know to be true in effective communication?
It's interesting. There is no one truth, I think, is the one thing that is known to be true. What we need to do is be more effective at listening and understanding individuals' different behaviours or groups of people's actions and understanding of behaviours as well. I think too often communications has become a broadcast mechanism, whereas what we're seeing now and what is so much more important to be true is we need to be a lot more empathetic around listening to what people need to hear from you, not just what you want to say. So if I say one thing will be true, is it has to come from a place of listening and a place of empathy and understanding before you start communicating what you want people to either think, know, or do differently.
When you're working with your clients and you explain that to them, do you find that they readily understand that, or is it as senior executives they've got to the position of influence and indeed some cases power, and they haven't really needed to do that along the way because they've led effectively and they've been effective? Or do you think that there's a increasing sympathy and understanding that empathy is increasingly important as people become more empowered through technology and they know more because they have access to the world's information?
Absolutely. I mean, one of my most popular training areas at the moment is kind of the arts of storytelling. And so much of storytelling is about putting yourself more in the centre of the communications and getting people to know who you are as an authentic person, but also that fundamental is that you need to be focusing on your audiences first and foremost, what your audiences need to hear from you, the from to of where they are now and where you want them to be. And that is really increasing, particularly with a fractious world, that people find that they can't cut through in the same way that they wanted to in the past. So they needed to be a lot more nuanced in the way they communicate and a lot more almost like a one-to-one dialogue communications rather than that broadcast that we're so familiar with doing in the past. So when I train communications people or train people in the art of communications, we often start with a lot of in-depth understanding of who they are as people, what makes them tick as someone, what their triggers are, how they like to communicate. And there's a lot of quite in-depth conversation that happens with that then makes them able to be a lot more empathetic of who they're speaking to and why. And I think that from a leadership perspective is a good thing, because the more leaders know themselves, the more they become much better communicators as well. So that trend, I think, is really important. Although we're seeing at the moment a bit more of that command and control coming back into place as well. So there's almost like a bit of a tussle between leadership styles and communications is that thread of how you show up, how you have impact and influence, and how you bring people with you on a journey that is quite fractious at the moment.
And is that move to, or the move back to, command and control, is that driven, do you believe, by the fact that people feel that they don't have control, that they're looking to hold on to things tightly to try to bring some kind of certainty into a discussion or a debate or a campaign, that it sort of lives inside a context that's quite febrile and could move either way very quickly?
Look, we are in a state of mass change at the moment. I mean, we're not saying anything that people don't already experience and know. A lot of the times we talk like into the industrial printing or the industrial revolution, and these times of change kind of make people fearful. They don't know what the future looks like in the same way. They look back on 10 years and just the huge range of channels and communications and division that we're seeing. So naturally, people kind of grasp at a time of, having a bit more control, something they understand. And, and that makes people fearful. So I think there is, and then you've also got this whole generational issues happening within workplaces. And I find the debate around generations really interesting. I don't know how much it's having a conversation in Australia. It's very much a big conversation in the UK around having 5 generations in the workplace and the communication styles that they all want in a different way, the way that they want to access and take in information. And that means leadership needs to be able to resonate with all those needs of different people, which makes it quite hard for them. So I think there's a real opportunity for people to just sit back and kind of think, well, what do they need to hear from me, and how do I flex my communication style more effectively to make that land?
So with that 5 generations in the workplace, can you take us through that sort of a contextual analysis of what that looks like at the moment and where the challenges are, but also where are the opportunities as well in this?
I mean, I think the challenges is that we're not necessarily listening and respecting and understanding each other's experiences and differences. I was at a really interesting breakfast meeting a couple of weeks ago where we had kind of an academic talk about the different generations in the workplace. And like a lot of it is stereotypes, and a lot of people roll their eyes when we kind of say, oh, Gen Z this or Boomers that, and Gen X is just generally forgotten anyway. Gen X and myself. And but I think those stereotypes are useful. But I think one thing he really said that struck me at the time was, we have these generational issues which are more reflective of people at that age they are. So a lot of the things they talk about with Gen Z are more things you'll talk about anyone who's in their 20s and early career, and would have been said around Gen X when we were in our 20s in the kind of 80s and 90s. But then also there is a specific around Gen Z around the future that they're looking towards, around they're in a massive great change around technology and how they're almost seeing the future in quite a negative way. So to bring hope, to bring an opportunity for them to shape their future is a real opportunity for leaders to communicate differently, to communicate with that people, you're bringing people in, you're not telling people how to be, you're not telling people how to act or give them a path that no one knows what that future looks like. So I think there's a real difference around Gen Z want to be part of that conversation, and they should be part of that conversation. And at the same time, at the other end of the spectrum, we've got massive issues with ageism as well, where experience and knowledge and, the people who have been through think cycles in the past aren't being listened to in the same way. So again, I think there's a real opportunity to learn from the past to help shape the future, but we need to do that across all the generations and be a little bit more understanding that, things are, not what, in some ways they're what we're seeing before, in other ways they're not what we're seeing before, but we need to be open about that as well.
So is it in your experience that whether you're a Gen Z, an X, a Boomer, that across generations that stories are valuable and useful and a consistent mechanism for encouraging understanding and action?
Absolutely, because you put the human at the centre of the story. It enables you to ask better questions as well. I think this is something else that I've become much more noticed in my communications practice, and particularly in the training that I do with senior executives, to encourage them to ask better questions, to probe, to validate what the assumptions that they're making, and to be more open to different points of view. And that's been quite an interesting one because, again, they've been trained to talk at people. And actually what we're seeing with the communication style, it has to be a dialogue. It has to be a to and fro of communications and questioning and understanding. And then you can actually land a communications point that you wanted to land because it's built on that shared journey. And I think, from a generational difference, that's what we can do a lot more of. We can ask better questions. We can be more open to people's different experiences, and we can limit the assumptions that we make around people based on their age, their ethnicity, their gender. And I think that's where we get a lot more power and bringing people together if we just lose those assumptions that we have. How
hard is it for people to learn the skills of storytelling if it's not something that's been part of their education up to a certain point, and say they've achieved the status of a leader in either a public or a private sector organisation, and they've communicated a particular way throughout their career, and now they're finding themselves being told by you, me and others that they've got to be able to tell better stories. They've got to be more patient. They've got to listen better. How difficult do you find in your training business to take people on that journey of proving the value and then helping them to acquire the skills?
I mean, it's a lot of vulnerability with people, and that's why we often start with really getting people to understand themselves a lot more, not with the veneer that so many senior leaders do put on, and which we can understand because the workplace can be quite a competitive place. But I think that's changing for a lot of people. I think people can learn it when they see the impact it has on bringing people with them in a more effective way. I had one person who I trained on a one-on-one basis, and we were preparing for a town hall that he was doing. And, he kind of gave his speech and he was all very kind of like, I can do this. This is a waste of my time. And when he presented it, I just looked at him and said, that could have been an email.
Right.
And it stuck with him. Right, we had another session last week, and for him that was his light bulb moment of, I'm just imparting information that can be an email. I'm not making people feel anything differently. I'm not making people be inspired by the vision that we've got. I'm not taking people on that journey of where the business needs to go and their role in that journey. I'm just imparting factual information that could be an email. And that has been a lot of my, particularly meetings that can be emails or other things can be emails. We need to use the spoken word and connection with people to build connection and differentiate the different levers of communication that we can pull to have a different impact. So I think that was a light bulb moment for him. And I think there is, and it's also when they reflect on how they're engaged and what inspires them, then they start seeing how they need to kind of show up in a different way. And I think that's where it always starts from.
Probably you have to, maybe it's a bit of an unreasonable question, but to just if you reflect on your practice and the work that you're doing at the moment, do you believe that there is an emerging or perhaps an evolving understanding of the importance of effective communication, particularly at times now where there is dislocation, there is challenge, there is rapid change and transformation? Are you finding that the people you're working with are increasingly understanding that I've got to do a lot more than I've done in the past, and I have to be a lot better at communicating effectively because that's what's required for my team and organisation to perform at its best?
I would like to think so. It will be universally a kind of thing that people want, and therefore they need more communication support and trainers. But I think it depends on where your industry is and how your industry is being impacted by the changes. So, for example, are you investing in communications because you need to build a culture to boost productivity, to then get the business moving in a lot better way to cope with changes? So that requires a communications for your internal audiences. Or do you need communications to lay the foundations for your license to operate with external stakeholders? So therefore you need to be a lot more intentional with those external stakeholders and communicate with them around that shared benefits of how they can be involved with you. Or do you need to be influencing government on legislation, again, laying the groundwork for your business? So communications is the red thread through all of those actions. And that red thread requires nuance and difference depending on the outcome and the business outcome you need to have. And one thing that is not happening, and this is the other thing, is that influence is being bred by power. And we're seeing that in some sectors and industries, and which is a bit of a worry around some of the tech world. And how do we then make that more universal and the impact it has on society as well? So I think for businesses to succeed, they absolutely need to show up in a way that reflects the audiences that they need to affect. I think the whole idea that we had a few years ago, and I've said this before on a podcast as well, is like the whole notion of business as a force for good, I think is not helpful, because it's all about purpose in a way that makes businesses operate in a way that isn't true to how they are, which kind of almost negates the profit and the growth that they also need to make, and be honest about that. So I think there is an opportunity to be a lot truer for businesses to speak more honestly and openly, and that means talking about profit and making money and how they impact society in a more effective way, and being more honest. And I think you said in your introduction around transparency, and that's where transparency becomes quite important. But transparency not just for the sake of it, transparency that to what end? And to what end is it? To what end to your employees, to your stakeholders, to your customers and your consumers? And having that clear in your strategy makes it a lot easier.
You have also worked quite a bit around sustainability and the communication of sustainability in organisations as sort of a cultural foundation, behavioural foundation of the way organisations and people act. Where do you see sustainability at the moment in terms of that's perhaps a priority for the organisations that you're working with? Is it something that's now they've gone past and they've parked it, or is it something that's still central to the narrative of their organisations?
I think it needs to be seen. I think we went through a stage of setting these targets and it became like almost competitive. Maybe not so much in Australia, but definitely in the UK. We had a real competitive around target setting and around carbon reduction, around net zero. And it ignited a conversation, but it didn't ignite action. Whereas I think sustainability is absolutely central to a business, but it needs to be seen through two lenses, which are of the same coin: the risk to the company and the opportunities that the company may have. It is not a nice to have. It is, so for example, in food systems and food production, the risks that they have from weather events and climate change are there. They're non-negotiable and they're happening. So all those risks need to rise up the risk agenda, the risk matrix of an organisation. And businesses need to act to be able to limit and mitigate those risks. So I think the climate and the sustainability agenda needs to be seen through that lens more importantly, or supply chain risk, or production risk, or risk to employees and the social movements around employees being involved, particularly in production markets that you may be operating. So that's one lens I think sustainability has to be seen through. And where communications and corporate affairs plays a really good role is connecting the dots on the risk register with reputation, with opportunity, with all the different stakeholders that play a role in mitigating that risk. The other side of opportunity is where there is an opportunity to innovate, to produce new products, produce new services, to new businesses that are coming up to help mitigate the risks. And we've seen a huge rise in reporting around sustainability. Now we need to see a huge rise in the opportunities to not only solve the issues we're seeing with climate change and extreme weather events, but also new industries being created to help those companies mitigate the risks that they're seeing already from the extreme weather events that so many around the world are seeing.
Now, that's a positive frame that you've presented, the opportunity to talk about sustainability. But do you concede that often organisations, particularly publicly listed companies, get mugged by reality, and things like increasingly expensive energy costs mean that decision making becomes we've got to make. Yes, I understand that all of those things are important, but I've got to report my numbers over the next little while. Hence, I'm going to be making decisions that are going to help me to, have this organisation perform in a way that's good for my compensation. So it's a challenge, isn't it, trying to marry the short term, the medium term and the long term?
Exactly, and it's all got to be about trade-offs. And I think the whole notion of trade-offs isn't discussed enough. I mean, Alison Taylor in her book Higher Ground, which is a fantastic book if anyone hasn't read it, she comes from very much a risk background, but has talked a lot around what role business needs to play from a compliance risk and also the role communications plays in that. And one area is just we need to talk about trade-offs. We need to talk about the decisions that we make, how that may impact in the short, medium, and as you said, long term. When you use examples like energy costs, we had a fixation on net zero for various reasons, but energy costs and net zero are intertwined. And so the investment you make now needs to have an opportunity to reduce the energy costs and the burden that you have of being liable to fluctuations in energy. So the companies that started investing in using renewables more effectively enabled them to withstand some of the big shocks around energy prices that we're seeing. But I also think the whole conversation around energy needs to be a lot more, not so much nuanced, but just a bit more accepting of the fact that we have different energy sources and they all play a role in society, and they will play a role in society from the medium to longer term. But that doesn't mean it's an either or, that we can't make changes. So for homes, for example, there's a big push in the UK to put solar on your homes. When I come back to Australia, I'm always quite shocked at how little people use solar, particularly for home-based energy. Industrial energy use is something different that requires more stability, whereas you can have options in homes to reduce that energy burden. And when we put solar panels on our house, we could really monitor and see what we were sending back to the grid and what we weren't. So you have a lot more agency in the choices that you make around how you're using your energy. So I think there's those trade-offs need to be understood a little bit more. We're kind kind of been put into this divisive, it's one or the other, and there isn't. It's just a murky, lots of different options and greys and trade-offs that we can make, that if we have an honest conversation about it, we can probably have a better debate about as well.
But then how do you communicate effectively in that murky world that you've clearly articulated there? Because it's a nightmare, isn't it? To try to be to try to be consistent and to try to be effective and to try to understand and have listened to multiple stakeholders who all have different views about what you should or you shouldn't be doing, and then how do you divine the line perhaps that you want to stay on that gives you some flexibility to be sort of left and right of arc of that without undermining the integrity of that position that you've identified as perhaps the best for your organisation. So how with all of that complexity and challenge and everything else that is rolling around at the moment, how best do you advise people to stay true and to be most effective in that type of context?
If this was easy, then I think it would be a whole different conversation.
Yeah.
And I think it's the acknowledgement that it's just not. And I think there's also, I think when I talk about talking about trade-offs, it's also about withstanding that not everyone is going to agree with you and not everyone wants you to do the same thing. And having a ability to articulate the reasons why the decisions what we're making. And I think where we've gotten to a problem is that we have this almost expectation of a purity of perfection of change, that everything is pure and we will only change because everyone's going in the same direction. And when we acknowledge the messy, then we can traverse it a lot more easily. But at the same time, it's acknowledging we don't have all the answers invites a conversation with people, but also acknowledging the vested interest that people have. And I think this is something else that we don't talk about enough, is just calling people out and saying, I mean, there was a conversation we had in the UK recently, and I can't remember the exact story, but basically the politician ended up saying, when someone was attacking their policy, he just said, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? And it was just such a, let's acknowledge those vested interests that people have. So rather than just say that opinion is truth, just say, well, you would say that because you're supporting this agenda or this industry or this company. And that's fine. Own that, but don't make out that you have some kind of altruistic approach to how you're developing. And we see a lot with that, particularly with energy companies. And I think, and I'm not against energy companies, I think they have an absolute role to play, and I think they need to. And I think there's we need to involve them in conversations, which unfortunately I don't think we're involving them in enough. But, also acknowledge that they have a vested interest in the future of their industry. But we can make it a vested interest that is about transition rather than a vested interest than it's about maintaining the status quo. And this is where the divisiveness we're seeing in society, it's either one or the other, and there isn't.
So in terms then of the volume and velocity of communication in order to establish your position, whether it be with employees or external stakeholders or the media or anybody else, where do you sit and how indeed do you advise your clients about what does that cadence of communication look like and what is that mix of channels and what it looks like? How do you go about working through that analysis and assessment to know how much you should be doing or how little you should be doing?
It's a great question because it all starts with your strategy, and that strategy starts with who are the audiences specifically that you want to impact and influence and why. So when we're talking before around like employees require, like, what is it you want employees to do differently, or what do you think that they know about what's it? You've got the model, which I love, which I've been using for kind of a very long time, which seems very simple, but is like, what does your audience know now, and what do you want them to know differently? What do you want them to think now, and what do they think now, and what do you want them to think differently about your business, about what you're doing? What do you want them to feel? What's the emotional connection you have with the actions that you're taking, and what do they feel now, and how do you want to change that? Now, feel is a really interesting one because feel is something that's been ignited a lot by fear. And fear is something that we need to kind of put in check a lot around how we're talking about things socially. But there's another feel which is about hope and is about looking to the future, which I'd love for us to do a lot more of. And then it's what you want people to do differently or stop doing. And I think that strategic model of looking at your audiences makes it a really clear way, and then saying, well, what is the one thing that we need to be doing differently? And then what levers do we need to pull? So if we need to be changing or educating people, then there's, how do you use your own channels or website or updates or webinars or to educate people around the information they've got? If you want people to feel something differently, then how do you use the emotional cues and connections to build stories and to build resonance and put themselves in the story so that it becomes a lot more something they can feel differently? And then, of course, all the levers you can pull around behaviour change become important around what people are doing and how you want them to do something differently. So there is a whole mix of communications channels at our disposal. My worry that we often see is that people use that mix of channels as a checklist rather than a strategic decision around what is the most effective and impactful channels for the change that they want to affect. But so one is recognizing where people are now, where do you want them to be, and how do they get information more effectively? So you might need to do a mix of things, but be honest about those levers that you're pulling and honest about the outcome, the end goal that you're working towards, and how that can change over a period of time. So if you're running a campaign where your campaign goes in stages around where you may want to affect change in the future.
In terms then of the skills that you believe government communicators should be focused on, and we'll leave any discussion about AI, I suppose, to the side if we may. When you're looking at this skills acquisition and skills maintenance for people working in the communication function, clearly an understanding of AI and how it works and how it can be used to supplement the work that government communicators do is important. But perhaps what are some of the other skills in this modern communication environment do government communicators need to focus on in order to be relevant and effective?
And I think we're going back full circle in a way to what makes us human. It's that empathy, it's that understanding, it's that nuance, it's that political way to see people's agendas that aren't necessarily being said and heard and understood. So it's what I've always loved about communications. It's not so much what you say, but also what you observe and what's not being said. And what's not being said is sometimes as important as what is being said. So that ability to cut through some of that veneer, I suppose, is a really important part of communications, and that ability to listen, that ability to make trade-offs. And I think the focus on technology, which is, it's a reality. We're using it. And I think there's a whole other conversation and debate around the efficacy and ethics of AI. But one of my biggest concerns around a blanket use of AI and different tech is the homogenizing of people and assumptions. And humans are messy. Humans, that's who we are as people. And, the people who have much better understanding and insight into human actions, and it's not always as black and white as tech might, describe it to be, then you have a better way of having impact, because then it comes back to the humans that you're trying to affect change to and understanding who they are and where they are then. So I just think it needs that balance and that mix. That doesn't mean it's not an either or. It's having a balance and a mix. It's about using technology in the right way, but then also having that human understanding, that human intuition a lot more effective. And I think the debate around AI sometimes can be, again, like everything in society, very binary, and it's not helpful at all.
How do you advise people to carve out time for curiosity in the way that they go about their work? How do you encourage them? And again, how do you acquire the skill of being curious if you're not curious, if you're not a curious person?
But who isn't a curious person? And I think it's about kind of really reframing that in people's minds. And again, someone else I've been coaching recently who is known to be very, he's very clear, very ordered, very organized. And so what we had a conversation around putting himself in the shoes of other people. And also we had a conversation about the things that irritated him. And we had a conversation on what his triggers were. And then we're able to turn that around into kind of how his actions might impact other people and be a little bit more understanding it. That, again, was a real light bulb moment around how to put himself in the shoes of other people. So I think, again, it starts with yourself. It starts with understanding yourself. And I think for me, that's something that I've kind of worked on over getting older and, more experience. And, things I would tell my 20, 30-year-old self would be something completely different. And I think we need to have that conversation with people earlier in their careers around understanding that. Because curiosity is something that should be celebrated and asking questions. And I remember someone saying this to me early in my career, you should ask more questions and more probing. And I don't think I really got it at the time. And I think that's something that we can do a lot more of. But you get people involved and they understand why they feel affected by things and why they might get annoyed, triggered, joyful, excited, all of the kind of different emotions. And then you can turn it around to how do you encourage that in other people as well.
Yeah, it's interesting though. I've been conducting a bit of a social experiment over the last 6 months or so around curiosity and engaging people in conversation and asking lots of questions to start with, but then trying to dial it back to see whether it comes back the other way. And I'm finding that people often are a bit uncomfortable, like they're comfortable on their own ground, but not so comfortable as wanting to ask too many more questions for whatever reason it may be, that they feel that they should already know or that it's rude or however. So what advice do you have for people to ask more questions?
I mean, I think this is a real problem we've got with, people. The expectation that people have that they should know everything is a problem in itself, because no one does at all. It's just the joy of living is in the learning and so but maybe that's just in the nature that I've got now. But I'll talk a bit about the campaign that we run, Break the Silence, because when we first started Break the Silence, and it is in context of this as well. So, but when we started Break the Silence, it's a campaign that was created this year on the back of looking again another report showing how women are leaving the workforce for various reasons, and they put a number around the missing women, and particularly in PR and communications in the UK. And it was a really interesting report, very, very well done. But it was the same thing of interviewing, talking about women, solving women, and about changing women. And a lot of us got quite frustrated with it. We've heard all this before. This has been going on for a long time. We kind of know what the diagnosis of the issues are. What are we going to start doing differently? And then we started talking about we need to engage men in this conversation in a more effective way. And we need to get some better data to understanding what men's thoughts are on gender equity and the future of the industry more broadly. And so we conducted this survey. It's kind of the largest of its kind, where it really started probing men and women. In the UK, the PR and communications industry is a general split of 60 to 40, 60% women, 40% men. That reverses quite substantially when you get to senior leadership, and that's part of the problem as well. But and so we really had to try hard to get men to fill in the survey and contribute to their views. And we got about 31% of contributions from men, which is a really good start, and we're looking to do a lot more. But what came out was this whole idea of they don't want to say the wrong thing. They don't want to offend people. They recognise the benefits they get from the status quo, and therefore they don't want to necessarily change that status quo because that doesn't want to impact them and how they are affected. So this whole idea of raising the pie for everyone became, an issue that they hadn't quite understood. And then when we had the launch event, then we had this whole kind of a bit of a tension in some of the tables, and it was brilliant because we had kind of people from different ages, men and women, different backgrounds, in-house agency, government comms as well. And there was this frustration at one of the tables, around the allyship table, that when someone would say something and women would be like, how could you not know that? And he's just like, because I don't. I haven't lived your experience. And then we had better dialogue. And so now we don't need to be, the whole point of breaking the silence is listening labs and opening up that dialogue in a psychologically safe way, in a way that's open and anticipates and accepts that people come at things from different perspectives. And I think the blame culture we have is the problem. And because we're not being open and hearing people's expectations. And I think you can have that same conversation around a lot of the race debates that we're having at the moment. And I think we can have, that same issue of just how do you put yourselves in the shoes of other people and their experience and have a better conversation that is open and challenging, but, and not to change people's opinion, just to kind of see, well, where are they at? Why are they at that position? Why do they think that? We need to kind of be clear. Men may not want to see change on gender equity, for example, because they think, rightly or wrongly, that it's going to impact them and their career. Acknowledge it and then work out a solution that's going to change it. And I think that's where we can do a lot more around, a better dialogue, better listening, and not a judgment, not listening that is framed in judgment, because that's, I think, where you get people get very closed and not want to actually have the conversation.
So for Break the Silence, 3 to 5 years' time, what's success look like?
The tangible success is we need to start keeping women in the workforce at senior levels. That is one obvious area. But we also need to understand why women are leaving and look at the culture that needs to change, particularly for agencies in particular, why women are leaving their senior, and there's a whole issue with ageism. But I think what we want to be doing is a better conversation that involves men in that conversation more effectively and has a shared agenda for what the future of the industry looks like. Because the one thing, the industry is changing regardless. This is just one area that can be influenced by the change in the industry, that we can start shaping that future more effectively. So what I'd love to see in 3 to 5 years is an industry that is more open to different styles of working, more open to people's different career paths and the squiggly career paths that different people take. And, and tangibly an industry that isn't framed about burnout and busyness and, and actually starts looking at the way the industry can work more effectively to drive change.
Final question. What excites you at the moment about the function of communication and the jobs that exist inside the communication function?
I'm really excited by the opportunity to put the human back much more centrally into the communications that we want to change and we want to use. I think we've gotten overly excited by noise and channels and opportunities. And I think we need to kind of put what role do humans play in that? So I think that's quite exciting. I think it's also daunting because the industry and how people make money is by creating lots of just stuff and content and everything, and cutting through that is quite hard. But I think the more we recognise our own human action, I think the better we will be, and then we'll be able to influence businesses to be a little bit more human-centric, I suppose.
You optimistic?
Depends what day you ask me, actually.
What about today? You're here today. Tell us about today. Are you optimistic today? You're in Lausanne in Switzerland. It can't be all bad.
It can't be all bad. I've got a great day. I've got some really cool meetings with some people who I'm coaching, which is, and one of the people I've kind of spoken about today is one of those people who are really being able to affect change. I think, I'm optimistic in my own world. Am I optimistic about the world in general? No. And I think when I saw Barack Obama speak a couple of weeks ago in London, and something that really hit home to me is that the notions of democracy and peace and all these things that were somewhat we take for granted are things we need to work on more effectively, and we're not working on them enough. And if one thing I want people to do when I talk about being human is kind of, what does being human mean to you? And he said, the human experience over history is more about dictatorships and authoritarianism and all those kind of things. That is not how I want to live my life. And that's what makes me quite worried. But I think there's an opportunity to change that conversation if we do it with intention.
Very good. Well, we'll leave it on that note because you're right. I think with intent, a lot of good things can take place. And yes, if people can reflect perhaps more about that human experience, not just their own, but others, and see themselves in their community and how they can contribute more effectively, but to the role and to the work of government communicators to they have a central role in helping communicate that message of government and effective regulation and other things. So it's very important that they remain optimistic and they continue to work hard and efficiently and effectively. But Natasha Plowman, we'll let you get on with your very busy day, and thank you so much for spending some time with us today on GovComms. The purpose of GovComms is for people to learn, and there's no doubt that today you have imparted a number of very valuable pieces of wisdom, which I have written down on this is what I do most weeks, is I take all these things away, and it's like, okay, I hadn't quite thought about it like that. So again, the curiosity piece of being a host of a podcast that's been running through since 2015 about Gov Communications. We've been talking about it for a very long time, and we've had hundreds of guests, such as your good self, coming on to share their wisdom with others, and we are very grateful that you would do that for us today. So thank you very much for joining us on GovComms, and to you, the audience, thank you for coming back once again. Very grateful for all your ongoing support. A like, a subscribe, a share, a comment, some sort of indication that you are human and that you are out there and this program is of value to you would be much appreciated. And thank you to all of you who do that on a regular basis. So grateful as ever for you coming back and to listen to another great story from the world of government and wider communications today, as we heard from Natasha. You can, as I say, rate or review the program. That does help us to be found. So wherever you're listening to this podcast, please jump on the podcast and just let that happen. And that will certainly be of value to us. You can also find all the latest information, updates and insights from all this and all other GovComms episodes on LinkedIn at GovComms Institute. A joy to speak to Natasha today, and we look forward to bringing you another great story from the world of communications in the next fortnight. But for the moment, please be kind to each other. My name is David Pembroke, and it's bye for now.